Hey folks, and welcome back. Joshua here. This video is part 2 of a two-part series on communication. Part 1 covered my acronym BITES, which went over very specific behaviors that you can do to work towards being assertive in your communication and expression. In this video, I want to cover 4 main communication styles that people oftentimes find themselves being in. I'll be covering passivity, aggression, passive aggression, and the one that we're shooting for, assertiveness. Stay tuned. So the way I like to describe communication to my clients, in almost all, it seems, human behavior, is that it falls on a continuum. And what I mean by that is at any one point, someone might behave passively, or they might behave aggressively, or they might even be passive aggressive or assertive. The point is for most folks, we don't stay in one particular communication style 100% of the time. And we do have our tendencies. So that continuum means that in our style of communication and behavior, we're sliding up and down. Now the goal, of course, is to be more stable. What we're shooting for is that middle ground of assertion. To begin, a passive communication style is identified through a practice of withdrawal. Within withdrawal, what happens is the passive person is fearing conflict. Really, that's the name of the game with a passive communication style. They've decided and defined confrontation as a dangerous thing, and so what they've done is they retreat from it. Now, there's a couple of main ways that can look behaviorally. One is to simply withdraw and avoid any particular issue that may come up in the relationship. The other one, which still involves withdrawal and avoidance, is to placate. Now what that looks like is just taking all of the blame for whatever the situation is. Most of the time, in any given situation, you're going to have 2 or more people that all are fairly equal in the reasons for something happening. Right? Everyone has their own responsibility. The passive person, though, generally takes on all of the responsibility for the blame. Now this is really great for a dependent relationship because one person who might very well be aggressive does blame shifting, and we'll get to that, and the passive person just takes that all on. Now what happens with the passive person is then they get really stuck in a place of resentment. And the reason for this is very largely they don't know what they want, or they do know what they want and they either don't know how to assert it, or they don't think they deserve what it is that they want. And so it becomes this really nasty, vicious cycle of having their self-esteem eroded over time. And it can appear as though the outside world and other people are eroding it. But really what's going on is the passive person is not expressing who they really are. They may not know. Not knowing is fine, but regardless, when you withdraw from other people, of course, you're doing that same thing with yourself. And so they may not know who they are because they're withdrawing from those very questions that would help them find out who they are and what they want to do in this world. Like you might imagine, aggressive behavior looks very different than passive behavior, and of course it looks like the opposite because, hey, it's on the opposite side of the spectrum. So with aggressive behavior, what you have here is lashing out. Now, there might still be fear of conflict like with the passive communication style, but with aggression, they find wherever that conflict is and they go and try to beat it over the head. Now that's not to say that they're physically aggressive, they might be just verbally aggressive, and very often it's just that. But with aggression, what's happening, like I mentioned earlier, is that there's blame shifting going on. So the passive person oftentimes takes on the entire burden of blame in the situation, and the aggressive person takes none on. So notice then that both the passive person and the aggressive person are doing the exact same thing, they just do it differently. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to avoid what they find dangerous. The aggressive person finds feeling guilty dangerous. The passive person finds conflict dangerous. So that'll be the overarching theme in this dialogue, is to recognize that when we're coming from any communication style that's not assertive, there's fear that is spurring on that communication. And so as we chronically express ourselves in a passive or an aggressive way, the boundaries that we have for ourselves and with others can be defined. With the passive person, what you'll find is that you'll have a very porous boundary. What that means is that anything that comes in is able to come in and oftentimes gets stuck. So again, blame, and there's a lot of shame that happens with that, and anything that might keep the person from feeling like an individual self. The aggressive person, on the other hand, has a very rigid boundary. They're doing defense in a different way. Instead, they try to keep everything away. So you have the porous boundary for the passive person who lets everything in, and then you have the aggressive, rigid boundary that tries to keep everything out. Again, it's founded upon fear. Once that belief that something is dangerous, specifically our own responsibility in the situation, then those two styles can soon start to evaporate. So passive aggression, of course, is a combination of passive and aggressive behaviors, but it has its own nuanced flavors. The hallmark of passive-aggressive behavior is manipulation. So where the passive person withdraws and the aggressive person moves forward, the passive-aggressive person attempts to play a dance. And what they want to do is they want to stay more engaged than the passive person and less intense than the aggressive person, but they're still trying to get what they want through underhanded means. So what that can look like is a very specific process of undermining the other person. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you're having a fight over chores at home, a common example I use. And so the wife comes up and says, you know, it's been a long time since you've washed the dishes. I've been doing a whole bunch of them. Me, the passive-aggressive person, might say something like, well, yeah, that's true, but it sure would be nice to not have to work as much as I've been working all week long. So it might be a silly example, but notice what I'm doing. I'm trying to tell the wife that the dishes aren't near as important as what I'm doing to support the family and household. So the indirectness of passive-aggressive communication comes out through what's called triangulation. So let's say I have an issue with a coworker. If I were assertive, I'd go directly to the coworker and talk to that person about the issues I might be having. With passive aggression, what happens is I go to someone else. It happens all the time, and at home, at work. People are not going to the person that they have an issue with. And so they wind up commiserating with that other person, setting up a triangle between you, the person you have an issue with, and this other person who probably has no business at all being part of the conversation. In triangulation, that's another part of that undermining that the passive-aggressive person is trying to do. They're trying to either directly with the person they're talking to or with themselves to have them believe that they're in the right. So in summary, notice that passive-aggressive and passive-aggressive communication styles all have these in common. They're all indirect communication styles, and what that means is they don't assert directly what it is they want to themselves first and then to others. 2, it's founded on fear. Fear of conflict, fear of being wrong, fear of feeling guilty. And lastly, these 3 communication styles all come with it a whole hotbed of emotions. Anxiety, frustration, anger, resentment. All of these come because we're indirectly attempting to get what it is that we want in this world. Only when we start communicating assertively can we get that peace and stillness that we're all shooting for. The person who practices assertive communication, and when I say practice, I mean practice. We are not going to be perfect at this. So when someone practices assertive communication, what they're doing is they're coming from a place of open, honest directness. What has happened long before the assertive person goes and speaks to anyone is that they know what it is that they want. They know themselves. Or if they don't know something, they're actively seeking clarification within themselves first. So it could be anything from, what do I want for lunch? Or what do I want to do when I get big? When we're assertive, we practice, again, those qualities in spirituality that keep us open. We're curious, we're calm, and most especially, we're gentle. The big difference between assertive communication and the other 3 is that assertive communication does 2 main things. 1, you directly go to the person that you have an issue with and you speak to them. It's that simple. You don't hide, you don't withdraw, you don't yell, you don't do anything that shows that you're afraid, because what you've done is you've already processed the fear. So you're coming to the person clean and ready to express the second thing that you do is you express what it is that you want. So you're direct and you express what you want. Although I stated that passive-aggressive behavior is manipulative, you can really look at all three of those behaviors as manipulative. Assertive behavior attempts to manipulate nothing. Now I want to point out something very key here. Expectations are something that really get us bogged down in our relationships. It took me a long time to come up with the phrase to highlight what it is I'm talking about with assertive communication, and that's basic requirement. So, with passive-aggressive and aggressive behaviors, when we lead with expectations, what we're doing is we're staying in a relationship that's not giving us what we need, and in those expectations, we're holding the other person or ourselves completely to blame for not actualizing what it is that we want. In assertive communication, what you've done is you've figured out what it is that you want, or you've got a good approximation, and you've come up with a basic requirement. A basic requirement is something that you need to have existing in the relationship for you to have health and growth. So an example of this is, let's say it's equal pay for equal work, or let's say it's respect in a relationship for families or for friends or whomever. The basic requirement is cleanly and directly expressed, and then you're done. With expectation, you may or may not have said something, and probably not, but if you did, it may have been loud or with a snarky tone. And then, when you've parted company with that person, you hold that anger and frustration for not having gotten what you want. With assertive communication, you've already cleaned up the whole process by recognizing that the other person doesn't have to give you shit. That's right, Acost. They don't have to give you anything. Now you're wanting them to, and you'd love to get whatever that thing is that you want, but you recognize that they have full reign of their choice. So with a basic requirement firmly and directly expressed, when you walk away, what you walk away with is peace. You give them the opportunity to decide whether or not they're willing and able to reciprocate. Now that obviously is provided the fact that you're asking something that is reasonable and measurable, something that you can actually get. But that's something we can cover in a different video, being really clear about your goals. But when you are clear, when you are direct, when you're calm, and when you peacefully express what it is that you want, then what you walk away with is more peace. Now, one final thing. That is not to say that in assertiveness you can't also feel something else. This can get a little confusing here. For a lot of folks, this tone right here, this tone is angry. And this tone can really turn people off. The thing is if there's still anger there and you still are in control, everything's fine from your end, provided that you recognize that you are in control and that you are not doing anything that is unduly rude or irrational. The problem is that tone I just gave might scare folks off. Assertive communication that comes with a little bit of frustration or anger very often gets triggered, and the person gets triggered and is reminded of aggression. So it's not for the faint of heart to practice, but you can certainly get there.